Sergio Perez will still be racing for Red Bull after Formula 1's summer break, a call that could decide who wins this year's World Championship. Red Bull team bosses Christian Horner and Helmut Marko met on Monday after the Belgian Grand Prix to discuss Perez's fate, as his woeful form is on course to cost Red Bull the constructors' title. After those talks, Horner told the team at its Milton Keynes base that Perez remains a Red Bull racing driver, and, we're quoting Horner here, we look forward to seeing him perform at tracks he has previously excelled at after the summer break. That's been widely reported as Perez keeping his Red Bull seat, but we need to add a quiet, for now, to the end of that. What has been shared not by an official announcement, but through leaked information, including to us, is very specific. That is often the way with Red Bull. So here's the situation. Perez will be in the car at Zandvoort, the first race after the summer break, and at least a few afterwards. Red Bull's not said he will definitely be there for the rest of the season, and Hornet specifically referenced seeing Perez perform at tracks he has previously excelled. We think this means Baku and Singapore, two circuits where Perez has scored 3 of his 5 Red Bull wins. Those races are now back-to-back due to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix moving to a later date, and they follow the final European races of the season at Zandvoort and Monza. After Singapore, there's an unusual autumn gap in the schedule, another opportunity, you might say, to re-evaluate the situation. Red Bull's decision is essentially to delay making a decision, partly because the team desperately does not want to replace Perez. It wants him to find the form that was so strong early in 2024 when Red Bull still had a car advantage and it seemed to be in a better working window. Giving him a few more races could combine to be the lift Perez needs, a show of faith in the face of recent Red Bull generated speculation, a chance for Perez to signal a you to his doubters, and some morale boosting and form inducing results on 2 of his best circuits. But it could backfire. The slump could continue. Red Bull could lose control of the championship fight entirely and have less time to react. It's laudable in a way that Red Bull's taking a view that doing right by its driver will eventually do right by the team, if patience and loyalty can be rewarded with a Perez breakthrough. For the sake of Perez, those who have made the decision, and the many people at Red Bull busting a gut to win these championships, and with healthy constructors title bonuses on the line, it had better work. Perez's situation looked very shaky when he blew his chance to show he can be a robust support act to Max Verstappen in Belgium, the last race before the meeting between Horner and Marko, who said Perez completely collapsed in that Grand Prix. Perez had qualified on the front row for the first time since China 3 months ago at Spa, but tumbled down to 8th as the race progressed. Falling so limply to last of the lead group of 8 cars rammed home how weak Red Bull's second car currently is compared to its rivals. It let McLaren take another 9 points out of Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, and 9 points per race is the average amount McLaren's been cutting the gap to Red Bull in the 8 races since the Miami Grand Prix. Back then it was 115 points behind, now it's just 42. McLaren's car has caught up with Red Bull's in that time, but Perez's nosedive is the primary reason this points gap has been slashed. Because even though Verstappen doesn't have the best car anymore, he's still scored more points than anybody else in those 8 races, whereas Perez is a distant last of the lead 8 drivers in that period. And before George Russell was disqualified from Spa, the Mercedes drivers' points had dumped Perez to 8th in the Drivers' Championship, having been a strong second just 8 races ago. At this rate, McLaren will catch and pass Red Bull quite comfortably before the end of the season, but frankly, if it had nailed a few more races before the summer break, McLaren might already be ahead. Despite that, Perez feels his future has been unfairly speculated over during this run and has been at pains to stress that Red Bull has issues to solve and that we cannot waste any energy with all this speculation. Verstappen, to be fair, has also argued his teammate's not Red Bull's biggest problem right now because it has other issues with its car and the McLaren threat to worry about. Admittedly, the scrutiny on Perez is unique, but only because he is uniquely underperforming and putting his team in real jeopardy of blowing a championship it should win reasonably comfortably given the lead it's had. So why tolerate this and give Perez more time? Well, pulling the trigger is a huge decision, even ignoring any potential commercial implications. Back Perez and one of 2 things will happen. Red Bull will either stumble over the line, clinging onto the lead with the odd Perez highlight just about being enough, or it will be easily overtaken and Perez will be the reason why. Drop Perez though, and there's no guarantee of anything better. Maybe Red Bull will have a rejuvenated second car with both in the mix more often than not. Maybe Daniel Ricciardo or Liam Lawson, if Red Bull took a real punt for Verstappen's teammate, would be just as volatile form-wise as Perez, or maybe they'd be even worse. It seems that giving Perez more races, maybe just 4 including those 2 street circuits, is a last chance at regaining that early year form. And a little further into the season, the magnitude of the McLaren threat will be even clearer by then too. Red Bull's basically still living in hope and taking a chance it will get away with waiting just a little bit longer before it finally has to do something. Before we continue with the consequences this has on Red Bull's title aspirations, we can't ignore the uncertainty that keeping Perez creates for Daniel Ricciardo and how Red Bull will handle a driver logjam. Along with keeping Perez in the car after the summer break, there will be no driver changes at RB, so Ricciardo stays put alongside Yuki Tsunoda. An advantage of dropping Perez and putting Ricciardo alongside Verstappen would have been temporarily solving the issue of finding a seat for Liam Lawson, who would have replaced Ricciardo at RB. That still would have left Red Bull with the question of what to do with Isaac Hadjar next year. Hadjar looks on course to win the Formula 2 title and is deserving of an F1 chance, especially if RB is going to take on more of a nurturing role again for Red Bull Juniors. Perez out, Ricciardo in would have let Red Bull evaluate Ricciardo at the top team, and if he underachieved, it could possibly replace him with Lawson for next year after Lawson gets a half-season apprenticeship at the second team. Then if Ricciardo's out the picture entirely and Perez is long gone, Hadjar would have an RB seat. Or Ricciardo and Lawson could have continued full-time at Red Bull Racing and RB respectively, and Hadjar could have an intensive year as reserve and test driver waiting for 2026. There are a lot of hypotheticals in that, and apologies if you couldn't keep up, but the point is that Perez out would have given Red Bull a lot more driver flexibility. But now, who knows what it's going to do? What's the point of Ricciardo just sitting at the second team? If his decent pre-summer break form wasn't enough to move him up, then what will be, and what's his future without that prospect? When and how will Lawson get his future settled, with Red Bull needing to give him a 2025 race seat before September this year, or else he becomes a free agent? Will Hadjar just end up on the sidelines at the back of a long queue? Of course, keeping Perez temporarily or for the rest of 2024 entirely doesn't mean he stays for 2025. Maybe an off-season change and giving Ricciardo and Lawson full pre-seasons with respective teams is actually the neatest solution. But it's just another example of the unclear situation Red Bull's allowed to exist within its driver pool, and it is quite baffling that a top team allows this crucial area to be plagued by such uncertainty. Verstappen and Red Bull have gone into F1's summer break on their worst run since 2020. A season that started with Red Bull-led domination has evolved into at least one surprise title fight. 2, if you share Verstappen's concern that he could be caught in the Drivers' Championship by Lando Norris as well. Spa's been the scene of crushing Verstappen victories despite grid drops in the last 2 seasons, but the fact he could only get back to 5th on track this time means he's going on a holiday after a 4-race winless run, his longest spell without winning since before he was a world champion. Verstappen believes McLaren has for sure been the best over the last 5 or 6 races. Off the back of his furious wake-up call to Red Bull in Hungary, he was a little more measured at Spa, given he knew his grid penalty would make that a race of damage limitation, but his words still carried a clear warning. Neither Red Bull driver sounded like their team was still in control of the Constructors' Championship over the Spa weekend. They sounded like they're on the back foot and that McLaren's got the advantage. Verstappen said Red Bull had to analyse everything from race 1 all the way to here, needed to try to fight back after the summer break and see if we can actually improve the situation and turn it around. And Perez said the summer break was coming at a good time for Red Bull because it had been a bit lost recently. These are the words of a team in trouble, and there's a very strong case that McLaren is actually the favourite even though it's coming from behind. Verstappen said that Red Bull's got a race pace deficit, which means every race is now about limiting the damage. What many races leading into the summer break have confirmed is that the fight is close enough that tiny details can swing each weekend either way. The question of who will win has been decided by safety car interventions, strategy choices, slightly bad starts, driver errors, and even collisions between rivals, like Verstappen and Norris in Austria. That will add up over the rest of the season and ultimately decide the title. Which again begs the question, why is Red Bull risking fighting this fight one-handed? Norris is Verstappen's closest challenger in the World Championship, and Verstappen believes that Norris can beat him to the title this year. But Norris is still a long way behind, 78 points, and managed to lose ground in Belgium despite starting 7 places higher. Norris admitted he'd not been driving particularly well at Spa and described running wide and dropping his outside wheels into the gravel at the first corner after another iffy start as embarrassing. That dropped him to 7th, but it wasn't his only untidy moment in battle. He had good pace thereafter, but with overtaking so difficult, that early error made his life tricky. It was a scrappy weekend overall with too many rough edges. Norris can't beat a driver like Verstappen with these performances, but even if he eradicates the errors, to make up 78 points in the remaining 10 races is a huge challenge, even with a total of 284 still available. Norris was actually 84 points behind just a few races ago, so this would statistically be the second biggest points advantage ever overcome to win the championship if Norris were to do it. And that's after adjusting past seasons to take into account the fact that since 2010 there have been 25 points for a victory rather than 10, 9 or 8 in earlier years. There are factors on Norris's side. This is the longest season in F1 history, so it's easier for someone to build up a large lead and then lose it. There's also more sprint races to come, so more opportunities to score points, and an extra point available in each Grand Prix for the fastest lap. But unlike Red Bull, which has such a clear number 1, number 2 driver split, and let's face it, a second car that isn't anywhere near the lead car most of the time, McLaren has made no attempt to prioritise one driver over the other, and Norris has been beaten by teammate Oscar Piastri in the last 2 Grand Prix. Piastri's now only 32 points behind Norris, having gained 15 in the last 2 races, and argued during the Belgian weekend it's too early to prioritise one driver over the other. But he has admitted that if Norris were in a position to win the championship and asked him to help, he would. Whether this becomes a realistic prospect or McLaren ends up solely focused on the much more realistic Constructors' Championship, you have to imagine it will feel its chances are boosted by the fact Red Bull has kept Perez on, even if he's only getting a short stay of execution.